Deputy Dessie Ellis for 10 minutes.
30 minutes.
30 minutes, excuse me.
Right. Graham Good. Tá ásarum go bhfuilm ag déileáil leis an bille seo. Tá garcéim ann I dtaca le titíocht. We've waited over 3 years for a significant piece of legislation on housing from this government. This bill is certainly significant and some improvements to how local authority tenancies are managed, but it will do very little to change the course of the housing crisis which we are currently in. At present, we have just under 90,000 households on housing waiting lists across the state. This represents well over 100,000 men, women and children who are currently not adequately housed. Some are living in dangerous, overcrowded, unsecure, unaffordable and downright inhuman conditions. Many others simply cannot afford to house themselves on the private market due to unemployment, poverty or other factors. These figures represent the most vulnerable in our society, those who are denied the most basic right of a secure roof over their heads. They occupy modern slums, emergency accommodation, overcrowded family homes, hostels, B&Bs and hotels, most of which is at the expense of local authorities. They sleep on friends' sofas. I've spoken to people who are not living, they are simply surviving, as heartbreaking testimonial to the ability of human beings to endure. Some are even sleeping in cars, as we have seen recently. We have 78,000 households who, unable to afford the private market, must rely on rent supplement from the state. This subsidy, which is a subsidy of a private market which cannot provide for those in need, costs us $344 million a year. That is nearly $4,500 for every household in receipt. Many on rent supplement are dependent on social welfare, in part due to a ban on them working over a very limited number of hours. Illegal top-ups, following the introduction of 2 separate cuts to rent supplement rates and the new rent thresholds, have led many families to extreme deprivation in order to meet exorbitant rents. And that is the only term you could use to describe rent rates at the moment. In Dublin alone, rents have gone up by 14% since this time last year, and rents have already been rising steadily for the last 4 years. There is one simple reason for this that the Minister seems to want to ignore. Landlords are in a position now where they can charge anything they want, and people desperate for a decent place to live will pay. Daft.ie has never been so empty, as rent properties are snapped up in hours, taken without even a viewing. Landlords are now abandoning rent supplement and RAS as they feel that they can do very well without such state aid and the annoyance of the greater bureaucracy and the choice between setting reasonable rents or demanding illegal top-ups. The government seems to have forgotten that the private market is about profit, and right now profits are very good. There is no desire for private landlords to provide housing for all. In fact, that is bad for business as far as they are concerned. It's very basic supply and demand stuff. That is why we need the state. We need it to intervene where the public good is not served by this model. I don't believe there is many cases where it does serve the public good, but certainly in housing, the profit model left to itself is actively damaging to the public good. It was the profit model in housing and the light-touch regulation which led us into the economic collapse, and it will do nothing to tackle the housing crisis it created. The recent Constitutional Convention meeting recommended that the right to a home be enshrined in Bunreacht na hÉireann, and that it be enforced by the courts. We believe that people do have a right to a home, whether it is enshrined in the Constitution or not. We urge the government to set a date for that referendum, but we strongly urge that the Minister work in the here and now to realise a right which has already been signed up to by this state under UN Convention. At present, the right to a home is a sick joke in this state. There are measures which the government could undertake today which would ease the problems in housing and the suffering of so many people out there. Sinn Féin have outlined how €1 billion identified in the Strategic Investment Fund could be invested in social housing. This plan would build around 7,500 homes over 18 months, while creating jobs, raising council revenue and saving money on emergency accommodation and rent supplement. This new housing stock would also help to reduce rent rates, which would further bring down the rent supplement bill and protect private tenants at risk of losing their homes due to soaring rent rates. Of this 1 billion, 985 million could be spent to build 6,502 new homes for social housing, as well as renovating the final 948 homes left over after recently announced government plans to deal with the long-term vacant housing. This 7,500 homes represents 7,500 families given a new lease of life, a secure home and a chance to live in dignity. It represents thousands of jobs and millions in savings for the state. If 7,500 families were taken off rent supplement, it would save over 30 million a year to this budget. It would reduce waiting lists in 18 months by nearly a tenth on top of housing promised by this government already. The cost of allowing people to remain homeless and in emergency accommodation is so great that many other housing authorities around the world has decided that it would be more cost effective to simply house as many people as possible immediately in whatever housing is available and suitable. The authorities then pay the entire rent and provide supports as needed. This has been found to be more cost-effective and a successful way of ending homelessness, or at least cutting down on homelessness numbers considerably. In Utah, they are on track, not just with strategy, but in actual real terms to end homelessness. They decided that to house people was a more cost-effective route, and that is exactly what they did. They have reduced long-term homelessness by 74% over 8 years, while this has seen homelessness figures rise by similar percentages in the last few years. At present, we have nearly 300 people staying in hotels across Dublin every single day, costing this city around €20,000 a day. Millions a year, millions has been spent. This is the wrong approach. This is the busy season for hotels. So people, any person put out of a hotel now is adding to the homeless list. And we've seen examples where this has happened. I've seen them myself. The Minister has supported some Housing First pilot schemes. But we face a major problem emulating Utah and other places which have put full support behind this model. We do not have the homes available to house the people. That is a major problem, and there is one solution: a major investment in social housing, as outlined already by myself and Sinn Féin. You cannot house people in homes that don't exist or further distort the private market with state subsidy of rents. Which brings me to the important point of immediately dealing with rents. Rents are too high, and it is damaging to our society and our economy. Landlords are cleaning up while local businesses falter as people struggle to make their rent, which represents a growing proportion of their outgoing, swallowing up their monthly income. Rent control is not a new idea. It has been tried and tested in many places around the world and has been successful in keeping rents at a fair level when implementing reasonably and in conjunction with the provision of social housing. Just last month, the British Labour Party unveiled a plan to introduce rent controls. Maybe this time our own Labour Party took a leaf out of their sister party's book across the pond. I recognise and appreciate that you, Minister, have commissioned a report on rent control, but that is not enough. We need action on rents now. We are now creating a major bubble with rents. A report was commissioned on deposit retention schemes and delivered by the PRTB in 2009. We are still waiting for that scheme, which is badly needed also. In fact, Sinn Féin submitted an amendment to the residential tenancy bill last year, which would have provided for such a scheme, and it was rejected. This cannot be a rerun. I would also call on Minister to deal with the immediate and very worrying problem being faced by rent supplement recipients who face eviction due to their landlords demanding rent above the current threshold. This is a very serious and widespread problem and poses a real threat to putting many families on the streets and requiring emergency accommodation. Minister, you've made remarks on directed CWOs to operate with discretion in order to avoid evictions. And I ask that you push at Cabinet level that the Department of Social Protection would issue a directive in this regard. The Department must look beyond the short-term cost of breaking its own thresholds and consider the long-term expense and human suffering of these families being made homeless and forced to take up emergency accommodation. Is it not better that these families are kept in their homes for a few euros more a day than to be placed in a hotel or a B&B for close to €100 a night without cooking or cleaning facilities and at the whim of management? People have been sent to queue up in the foyers in the hotels, and some of the homeless people that are reported as homeless have been told to go there and wait until something becomes available. And in many cases, there's more than one room required for families. There are several rooms required for families. So it is costing, in some cases, for one family, a couple of €100 a day to house a person, to house one family. It is this kind of short-term thinking which has got us to the position where the biggest local authority in the state, Dublin City Council, built only 29 homes last year, while tens of thousands in the city are desperate for a home. These are the great problems faced by the people in need of housing in this state, and this bill will not do much for them. That said, there are some welcome improvements on current policy, although more could be done even on these points. The eviction of local authority tenants and repossession of the home is a very difficult subject, but I welcome that this bill does make steps towards improving what was a wholly insufficient procedure in terms of the rights of the tenant, but also those around them, the people that have to suffer in some cases where there are antisocial elements. At present, the legislation which is in place has been shown to be a violation of the EU Convention on Human Rights. It allowed local authorities to summarily evict people with a rubber stamp from the district court. This rightly was ruled by the Supreme Court to be incompatible with the state's obligation. Tenants who face eviction should have the right to a fair hearing, a due process. A local authority cannot be allowed to evict tenants on a whim or for other bias and unfair reasons, like could be seen in the case of my friend Councillor John Brady in Bray, given an eviction notice for rocking the boat and advocating for two women forced to live with their children in a completely unsuitable emergency accommodation. In the early stages of the drafting of this bill, it stated that local authorities would have to give 15 days warning to any tenant that they were seeking to evict, allowing them time to prepare for the process. This has been cut to 10 working days. Focus Ireland rightly said that this should be 30 days in order to allow appropriate time to gather advice and information. I support that call, and we will seek an amendment in this regard at the next stage. I want to also state that eviction is not the solution to anti-social issues, and it is and should always be a last resort. Anyone evicted from a local authority tenants is then the responsibility of the local authority when they acquire emergency accommodation. This should not be forgotten, and the damage that this can do to a family unit can be much greater potentially than the antisocial behaviour which was being engaged in. This trauma can make dealing properly with antisocial elements in a family even more difficult in future. It must also be remembered that where criminal activity has taken place, it is a matter for the Gardaí. The provision for the giving of tenancy warnings could be useful in preventing minor antisocial issues from developing into very serious problems. The issuing of these warnings and the process which follows must be clear and transparent and allow for proper engagement between the tenant and the party responsible for the problem and the council. This should not be allowed to be a measure for punishing or penalising people who are seen as a nuisance by council officials for whatever reason not related to actual antisocial behaviour. As tenants deserve a fair hearing in relation to eviction process, they must be allowed fair hearing here also. We feel that considering the housing crisis we face, that allowing someone with no succession rights to stay in a home which could be completely inappropriate for them for 6 months is not acceptable. There have been cases where single people who did not have any right to the former home of their deceased family member stayed in the property for an extended period, despite it being, in a case which I recently encountered, a 4-bedroom home. And so many other families in desperate need. It is unacceptable that people should stay in long periods after they have been told to leave these premises. I certainly feel that that needs to be addressed. If you do not have a recognised housing need and you do not have succession rights, then there should be no more than a period of respect for the bereaved and an appropriate opportunity for the person to find alternative accommodation or even remove possessions or any other items that need to be removed, because often that is one of the problems that you face with the local authorities. People that are very slow to remove items or other things out of the house. And it also, in some cases, it's a sentimental value. Some of these homes are regarded as family homes by some members of the families, even though they've no succession rights. But that doesn't give them a right to stay there, and that's fairly clear. Sinn Féin respect the right of local authority tenants to buy and its importance in maintaining communities and avoiding poor social mix. But this must not be allowed to deplete the social housing stock without sufficient replacement and increase in that stock. So while we support the inclusion of a tenant purchase scheme, we believe that the state must implement a significant house building initiative as a matter of priority. We also believe that the money got from these houses should go back into more social housing and should be targeted in that way. They shouldn't be allowed to throw it into the mix for other things. I think it's very important that we replace the stocks and also giving the people the rights to buy their own houses. We welcome the introduction of the housing assistance payment as a much-needed improvement on the rent supplement system. But it marks a failure of the government and successive governments to ensure that rent supplement remained a stop measure for private tenants in difficulty. The government have now adopted an approach which seems to desire a system where the state does not provide housing but incentivises the private profit market to do it, jobs in relation to social housing. We also fear that while the voluntary housing groups are doing a massive job, the main delivery of social housing should come from local authorities. And unfortunately, we seem to be going the opposite way, and now I think you're starting to draw back. And I hope that continues, because the local authorities are certainly the best. This cannot and will not work. The private market is incapable of providing housing to the extent it is needed at the value required. The state is the only vehicle for the delivery of quality, affordable housing for those most in need. We support the improved provision for people to work while receiving housing assistance, but share Focus Ireland's concern that maintaining people more recently unemployed on rent supplement is unlikely to help end the poverty trap it has perpetuated over the years, given these are the people most likely to return to work in the short or medium term. Placing only people who are long-term unemployed in the position where they can work while allowing newly unemployed to remain in rent supplements constraints makes no sense. We also share the Simon community's concerns about the standards of accommodation. The state should strongly avoid subsidising landlords, providing substandard housing. It is already scandalous that some landlords in receipt of rent supplement are not even registered with the PRTB. That is totally unacceptable. I would finally like to strongly oppose the idea of putting in place a system to mandatorily deduct rent arrears from the income and social welfare of tenants and rent assistance recipients. Social housing has been allowed by successive governments to become the last resort for the most vulnerable and poorest in society. The people in social housing or receiving social housing support are not affluent. They, in cases where arrears are owed usually have failed to budget correctly following a drop in income or a new expense. New medicines, social welfare cuts, water charges, back-to-school expenses, accidentally undeclared new incomes are often the cause of accrued rent arrears. In most cases, tenants are happy to work with councils to plan repayments. Most tenants I have dealt with who have rent arrears would have no problem with a direct debit type scheme for repayment of arrears, which was reasonable. To do this mandatorily would be a very negative step in how councils and their tenants relate to each other. It certainly would not be acceptable for a private landlord to be able to siphon money out of a tenant's accounts without permission to pay arrears. In saying that, my experience of local authorities, and particularly Dublin City Council, they do pull out all the stops to deal with people in arrears, and they are generally very flexible. But I think we need to be careful that we set this on a mandatory, and we start taking it out of their social welfare or otherwise. I think that would leave people with an awful lot of... in the past, they've had choices where they put bread on the table or to pay their rent, and in some cases, that's how the rent fell behind. The present system of repayment of arrears, while not perfect and requiring renewed focus, has the potential to work well and is based on cooperation between tenants and the council. This council would be devastating if applied in some case. This change would be devastating if applied in some cases, and I am strongly opposed to it. Minister, you said that we would end, our plan is to end long-term homelessness by 2016. At present, that target seems virtually impossible. I don't know how. We've 5,000 people on the homelessness at the moment. Last month, we had something like 40 new people reporting to homelessness. I mean, how are we going to end it? Home purchase, I certainly support the whole idea in terms of home purchase and the rights of tenants to purchase their own homes. I wait to see what the method and the mechanism that will be used. I think that's extremely important. I wouldn't, in terms of the financial contributions, I would like to see that used a bit more in terms of getting more housing, because it did prove successful in the past and it did deliver a lot of housing to the local authorities. But without rent control, all we're doing is going to increase the prices, because once the local authority starts trying to buy, the prices go through the roof, and we've seen it in the past. In a lot of cases where we have people in hotels, we have seen that many of these people have had no possibility of getting near schools. They've been put in faraway places. They've been moved all over the place. So this whole thing of the hotels, we need to keep people as close to their homes as possible, as close to their communities as possible, and as close to the schools and the places that they access. That should be a priority. And I know we are desperate. We're chasing hotels and we're putting people left, right and centre. Some people have had to go to 2 to 3 different schools within months because of them getting placed from one place to another. It's absolutely scandalous, and the pressure that it's putting on people is just enormous. In the past 2 years, we introduced a number of rules in the local authorities. This whole idea of crossing over from local authorities, I just feel that this has caused huge problems, Minister. I think it needs to be re-looked at, because we have a lot of people who, in the so-called good times, went, whether it was to Cavan or wherever, and bought into places, and now find themselves in serious trouble. And a lot of people are trying to get back into places where their families were or where they had their communities. And we are meeting this obstacle of crossing over from one local authority to another. And the same with people on the housing waiting list. You can't go on to Fingal if you're living in Dublin City Council, or Fingal, you can't go into Dublin City Council. I really think we need to re-look at that. This has only been introduced in the last couple of years, and I think it has cut down the choices for a lot of people. Choices of places where they actually lived in and where they wanted to be. We also have the issue, and I'm still not clear, because, Minister, people who had family homes, they lost their homes, or there was family discord between the husband and the wife or the partners, and they had to move out. We are finding with some local authorities that they cannot get housing, either through a rent supplement, which in some cases has happened in Dublin City Council, have been more flexible. They gave them a housing need letter to go to the welfare officers. I think that needs to be looked at. I think it's very unfair to say that someone who goes and unfortunately breaks up with a partner is now finding themselves out of a home or a place, and they're unemployed, etc., and they are excluded from getting on the housing list in some local authorities. The rule needs to be across the board that we can't have one rule in Cork and we have another rule in Dublin, because that seems to be what's happening from what I am hearing across the country. So I'd ask you, Minister, could we also look at that issue? It needs to be clarified for people. The housing crisis now is the worst I've ever seen it. I've never seen so many people in desperate need, and I've never seen so many people in such dire situations. And I say that it's not just on your watch, Minister. This happened with the previous government, and unfortunately, even in the so-called boom, they didn't produce the amount of social housing that should have been produced. We didn't. But the other area that may be something we need to look at much again is the whole area of the Part 5. You've said there's going to be some changes to this. I wouldn't like to think that if we do start building again, and that the private, that we would be conceding the 20% that we had originally gained from large, from large housing groups and large housing schemes. I do think that we should be reluctant to concede on that we should maintain that position. I know the Labour Party were very strong on this, and I certainly believe that we should remain strong on that. I don't think we should be conceding that too easily. I know there isn't an awful lot of houses being built, but if things are moving and we start addressing the housing market, I think it's important that we get those. And we also look at the whole issue of affordable housing, that we are in a position to go after affordable housing, and that is an area that has worked very well over the years with the local authorities. I think, Minister, you have an awful job ahead of you, because this is an absolute calamity now at the moment, the whole housing situation. And it's going to get worse, because we have a huge amount of people in mortgage distress. And the reality is the homeless situation is going to continue. In my opinion, it's going to increase. The housing lists are going to get bigger. And that's because we're now fighting, we're firefighting at the moment. And even that firefighting is going nowhere near helping the situation, because the situation has got so bad. If the banks get more aggressive now, and all the signs are that they are going to get more aggressive, we are facing one of the worst problems we've seen, and the worst human problems we've seen in this country for many a year. That is my worry, and I think the banks need to be put in their place on this. We need to look at demanding that people stay in their homes and pay rent. If they can't afford a mortgage, we need to be looking at that, and we need to be saying, you can't put people out. It doesn't make sense. Economically, it doesn't make sense that these homes are seized and people are put out. I think we have to address that. And I don't know, Minister, what your intention is there, but I certainly will be watching out to see what we're going to do and how we're going to tackle that, because that, to me, is the big crisis that's still to come. It's already with us, but it's going to get worse. And with that, thank you.